Please forgive me. Was not expecting this large of a room. So first time presenting at KubeCon, the contributor, so I'm excited to be here. Thanks. I'm Geoffrey Cline. I'm an open source technical writer at Amazon, and my counterpart, Chris, is in the audience. I'm really excited about open source technical writing at Amazon. So I came from legal writing, which huge change to the open source community, but I really love our platform. I like authoring in Markdown. I like using static site generators. It's cool that these skills are generalizable to other platforms. The source is highly readable, easy to author. It's fast to build and deploy. I like using Git to manage docs compared to like every other version control system, especially older things for managing Word documents. But there really are some challenges around like open source docs and the platforms that I've really had challenges with myself, and I haven't been able to find good solutions for. So there's versioning, which is how do you know if the docs you're looking at match what's going on with your cluster. There's search, which is self-explanatory. And finally, there's diagrams, which I think is something we should absolutely be using more to explain concepts to users. So getting started with versioning. One thing I was surprised to learn is that it's super important to docs users because a small percentage of them are actually running the latest version, but it's also very difficult to manage both in terms of how you implement these different versions, and then it's an additional workload on tech writers. So taking a look at like the two platforms that I'm familiar with, there's Hugo+Docsy, which is what we use for K-Website, and it's, interestingly, the archived content flag is build-wide, which was really surprising to me. And the Hugo nor Docsy have specific guidance on how to version your content. Mkdocs, specifically with the mic plugin, I was really pleasantly surprised by this static site generator. It has the best user experience for managing different versions of content. It's more opinionated by far than Hugo, and there's a little bit more of a risk of abandonment. But if you take a look here, this is wonderful to me that you can list the currently deployed versions, you can deploy a new version of the docs, and then you can delete an old one without having to do a whole bunch of like more manual management. So taking a look at how two sites do it right now, you can see the main Kubernetes site does it using subdomains, which requires more like infrastructure automation to do the DNS records and to make a new Netlify site for each version, which for smaller projects in the Kubernetes space probably isn't very feasible. So you can see Knative below, they just do different paths on the same domain, which is a lot easier to manage, but then you have like the same host is hosting all of them, and then when you change a version from the current version to the old one, then you have to change all the URLs. Well, at least the build tool has to. So my recommendations for if you're having challenges with versioning a open source doc site is for small projects, don't think about it too much at the beginning, wait until there's a breaking change. And then for many small sites, it's appropriate to do just plain markdown files, and then they live alongside the code, they're versioned the same way, usually with git tags. And then as your project grows in complexity, I'd take a strong look at using the Mkdocs mic plugin with paths working on the same domain, and then start thinking about doing pre-release docs. And that means pre-release docs means when you do like a PR against main, it goes to a pre-release or preview version instead of the currently released version. And then when you release a new version, the docs get promoted. I think that's a good pattern. And then as projects get into higher complexity, like you're using a lot of short codes or custom layouts, that's when you should start consider deploying different versions on different subdomains. There are some unresolved problems with versioning docs content. It's hard to link between different versions. It doesn't seem like there's an accepted best practice on how to do this. For example, like Knative I showed, they use Mkdocs, but they have their own custom build script, and a lot of projects have that also. I'd like to avoid that kind of like everyone figuring out their own way to do it. And then additionally, as we'll get into next, it's hard to search across different versions of the docs. So the two ways this is done now are like K website uses a Google programmable search engine, and then a lot of the smaller sites use Lunar, which builds a static index of the content when it's built. So here you can see Knative, which uses Lunar. I think it has a good UI, and importantly, you can see faded out the version selector. Whatever version you have selected, that's the version of the docs you're searching. So Kubernetes, interestingly, even when you have a prior version selected, the search results are always from the latest version. And then additionally, this was surprising to me, the search UI varies by browser, which I was surprised by. And then finally, a site I've worked on, Carpenter, this is probably embarrassing for me to say, but an example of what not to do since I set this up. You can see in the search results every single version is returning its own search result, and this has proved to be confusing for users. So recommendations for search. Again, I was very pleasantly surprised by how well Mkdocs handles this. It's easy to manage, the Lunar static index works well, but the static index that Lunar uses, it gets a bit cumbersome as the project gets very large. That's when you should consider using Google Programmable Search. One thing that's only 50% related that I wanted to talk about is GitHub code search. So I was surprised to learn from AWS support engineers that when they're searching for Kubernetes related information, a lot of times the first place they go is the GitHub search. And this allows them to search across many different docs sites all at once, like the AWS docs are published on GitHub, so are the Azure docs, and then of course the Kubernetes source markdown files are also. So this is an interesting idea I'd like to look into further, is if there's a way to kind of provide a unified search for all projects. So here you can see I searched for load balancer, and then there's some results coming in from different Azure projects, and then further down there's some things from Kubernetes. So that's a bit about search. I am blasting through these slides. Please forgive me for being a bit nervous. So next thing I wanted to talk about is diagrams. This is something I strongly feel like we should have more of. I think the reason we don't right now is because they're frankly very difficult to update and translate. And additionally, a lot of the tools we use are closed source and are incompatible with how we do things using static site generators. So for example, a lot of the images on the K website right now are SVG files. And those, some of the tools are expensive and not cross-platform. And if you take a look at this diagram here, like if I were to go and open that, like where is the source file for this? Do I have the proper fonts installed? So that it can be really difficult to update these things and then translate them, like I said before. One solution to this is Mermaid, which is a domain-specific language. Surprisingly, it is already integrated into our Hugo build process. And a feature I really like is that the diagrams are accessible to screen readers, which if you've ever had to do alt text for images before, can be a big pain to do that for diagrams as you are kind of re-explaining everything again. So great feature, these are accessible to screen readers. They're also easier to update and translate. However, a downside is that it's difficult to customize the appearance. So here is an example of both Mermaid source and an output diagram. So you can see in the left, this goes in line with Markdown. And I think the first part, fairly intuitive in terms of you're just kind of defining simple relationships between different chart elements. It is a bit inconvenient to have to paste in these class definitions that do the colors and line fills. That's okay though. And then you can see that it generates this pretty diagram here on the right. But the problem is that once it generates a diagram on the right, you can't drag things around or rearrange them. You're stuck with however Mermaid generates it, which can be frustrating if it's kind of doing the layout you did not have in your own mind. So for recommendations for Mermaid, I really think we should be using Mermaid more. You can try the quick start from the Kubernetes docs contributor guide. It is yet another language you have to learn, and it's difficult to control the layout and style. So in conclusion, in conclusion, I was really pleasantly surprised by Mkdocs. I've used Hugo way more in my open source technical writing experience. It does provide a much better experience for versioning and search. Those are two complex and important features of OSS docs. And then finally, use Mermaid for diagrams. I was hoping at this point to transition into more of like a docs contributor discussion, but I realize this room format is not super conducive to that. So I'll offer the opportunity for questions right now, or if you've had challenges with these things and how perhaps you've solved them, and then if not, I might just continue talking about some of my frustrations.
So if Mkdocs wanted to actually switch to Mkdocs, what's the migration process look like?
It's heavy. So I don't think so obviously the dream of Markdown is that we would be able to just feed the same Markdown files into a different static site generator and get the same thing. But there's a lot of kind of customized content and some things that are like the header or the metadata is a bit different. So I think it would be a huge challenge. I think my recommendation is for like smaller projects, consider using Mkdocs, but something that's truly as large as the main Kubernetes website, stick with Hugo+Docsy, and I think there's some improvements we can make, like perhaps figuring out what's going on with the differing search UI, and then see if there's a way we can provide a better way for people to search a specific version of the docs. So for K-website, prefer just kind of incremental improvements, and then if you're a smaller project, definitely check out Mkdocs. Thank you for your question, by the way.
So I've seen a couple different OSS docs setups where they handle versioning. One way is they have like a whole different set of directories. So you're in the same branch. There's like 5 different folders, and each of those folders has a different version of the docs.
Yes.
And then the other way is to have them on separate branches. So it just,
Yes.
The whole thing's you go to a different branch and you got a whole new set of docs. Can you just talk about the different downsides and upsides of doing it those different ways? And I think some of those affect search also, right?
Yes. So I'm going to pull up some slides that are slightly relevant. So there's, to recap, Chris's question is about the different ways of handling where you store the different versions of content. So Kubernetes does it in different previous tags, which I think is which makes sense for larger projects, but it can, sorry, I'm struggling to collect my thoughts here. If you take a look at the bottom one there, it's on the same host. So the default search scope will be everything on that domain, that host. And so unless you properly configure the search to show I only want this version 1.6, it will return results from everything that's in that build. So Kubernetes, that works things are on different domains. So theoretically, the search should be looking at just the current host, but for some reason, it always looks at the latest one. I'm giving a real rambling answer here, but it's very challenging. I generally recommend using I recommend using Git tags just to keep track of prior versions of the docs, but the challenge there is that if you have to go in and make updates, then you get kind of a rather complex history. That's what I recommend, but in my opinion, there's no good way to manage these different older versions.
Well, it is more like a comment or question. I don't know how to manage. But in the search portion, do you consider like searching for other languages besides English? Like, I don't know if those tools that you showed before, like, is searching also for Spanish definitions or things like that?
That is an excellent question. I did not, I have to admit that a tentative fourth one that I was considering adding to this was different languages, because that's different versions, but it's also truly an entirely other beast. I have not worked with authoring content for that is translated or published in a different version very much, but I suspect that a lot of these same issues exist for different languages. That's a good question, is how, like, if someone wanted to search the Spanish version of the Kubernetes docs, how would you go about that? I suspect it will probably have the same issue as different versions right now, where it automatically defaults to English in the latest version.
You mentioned it would be good for newer sites or newer projects to look into using these tools. What would you recommend for like where groups would start if they wanted to try using them?
That's a great question. Thank you. So if you, so I'll talk a bit about like creating a doc site. I think usually where you start with this is you have some markdown files from engineers that are unknown quality, varying if they're up to date. So I think that's often a good place to start, is just improving what's in place. And for me, that's always been markdown files, just living alongside the code. And then I think as your audience expands and the number of pages you have expands, that's when you should start using a static site generator. And so I think the easiest one, I think, to get started with is Mkdocs, because it's kind of like, it's integrated with the theme, it's very designed for documentation, it has a great search built in. So once you're kind of ready to move past the plain markdown file stage, I'd take a look at Mkdocs. And then as you grow in complexity, you start needing different versions, add on the Mike plugin for managing different versions. And then as you reach a very high level of complexity, your doc site is huge, you've got many different versions going on, that's when I'd take a look at the Google programmatic search engine, and I'd switch to using that instead of the Mkdocs built-in search engine, because it works better for larger volumes of content.
Follow-up question. What documentation do we have, or do you think we would need for folks to start adopting these? Because I'm from the contributor comms group, where we focus on making sure that folks understand tools that they can use and things that are going on in the project and stuff. So I'm wondering if there are things we could do to help.
So when you're looking at starting off with a doc site, I think there's two paths I think are helpful to get started on. First is look at like what are the like top 5 things we want people to be able to do. And I realize this is a bit easier for products that you're trying to sell, but look at kind of the top 5 tasks, and then also in parallel look at what people are posting about it in support channels or Slack channels, and try to design your content so that it around the currently outstanding need, because that working backwards from your docs customer, I always think is the best approach. And then hopefully if people are posting these questions in Slack, they're obviously struggling to find the answers. So if you use that same language, hopefully they will naturally find the docs site through search. So you can, when you're building a new doc site, you can either like focus on the things you want users to be able to do, but I think it's a better approach to try and understand what people are currently looking for. Thank you for your questions. Okay.
I guess we are out of questions, so thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize, I rushed through the science slides a bit, but thanks again.